Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission is to take a dense stack of research and deliver the crucial insights you need to be seriously well-informed, skipping all the noise and jumping straight to the calculus.
And today we are really zeroing in on this intense geopolitical standoff playing out in the Caribbean.
Yeah, the situation with the U.S. military buildup, these new terrorist designations, and of course, the Maduro regime in Venezuela.
Yeah.
It's escalating fast.
I'd say it's more than a standoff. I mean, this is a conflict in progress. What we're tracking is a situation that has pivoted violently from diplomatic coercion to active lethal kinetic action.
And the sheer scale of the deployment is just, well, it's extraordinary for the Southcom area, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. An armada of vessels, over 15,000 troops.
We have got to talk about this massive military presence. I mean, sources show that more than 10% of all deployed U.S. naval assets are suddenly in the Southcom area.
Wow.
That is an overwhelming focus. It's designed to project not just power, but, imminent capability.
It is. And what we have to unpack today, and a huge thank you to expert Traderick for this comprehensive research stack, is the crucial analytical shift.
Right.
The strategy is no longer about waiting for sanctions to work. It's about creating a legal justification for immediate, targeted military action.
They're doing that with these foreign terrorist organization designations.
Exactly. Using them to lower the threshold for strikes. And that has just profoundly changed the risk profile of the entire hemisphere.
So our goal for you is clear. We need to move far beyond the headlines. We're going to dissect the specific U.S. military calculus, understand the immense geopolitical constraints that are frankly getting in the way of a full-scale invasion.
And most importantly, confront the very severe warnings that analysts are issuing about stabilization failure if regime change actually succeeds.
The shocking context framing this whole deep dive is that we are past the point of economic pressure being the main tool.
Way past it. Since September 2025, we've seen this undeniable pattern of ongoing lethal kinetic action against boats suspected of, illicit activities linked to the regime.
So this isn't theoretical pressure anymore?
No, this is active conflict. And it defines the entire environment right now.
Okay, let's start with what you call the policy paradox. Because for nearly 2 decades, the United States relied almost exclusively on financial sanctions to try and force regime change in Caracas. It was a strategy of economic suffocation.
That's exactly right. Starting around 2006, and then it really ramped up dramatically through 2017 and 2019, the U.S. imposed layer after layer of sanctions. We saw financial freezes against individuals, institutions, asset blocks, and of course the big one, blocking oil imports from PDVSA.
The state oil company, the lifeblood of their legitimate revenue.
Right. The whole point was to create enough economic pain among the elite to force Maduro out.
But the sanctions, they just failed to achieve that primary objective, didn't they? Maduro was just sworn in for his disputed third term in January 2025.
He was. And this was despite independent tallies suggesting the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, had won something like 67% of the vote.
Wow.
But Maduro just claimed victory anyway. The external pressure was enormous, yet the regime, well, it proved resilient.
And that resilience came at a very specific and destructive cost. And this is the paradox we really need to highlight for you.
Yes. The extensive sanctions didn't just fail passively. They actively, and I mean actively, pushed the regime deeper into criminality.
How so?
Well, think about it. They were denied access to global capital, to legitimate oil markets. So they were forced to find other ways to make money, to find compensatory revenue streams to keep the government, and more importantly, the military functional.
So instead of collapsing, the regime just doubled down on illicit activities. What are we talking about specifically? What sectors did they really get into to keep the lights on?
It's primarily twofold. First, drug trafficking using Venezuela as a key transit hub for U.S.-bound cocaine. And second, and this is critical, illegal gold mining. And analysts confirm that this reliance on criminal enterprises grew so central to the state's survival that it ultimately created the very justification the U.S. administration needed to pivot away from sanctions and toward military escalation.
Oh, wow. So the sanctions themselves actually created the target.
In a way, yes, they did.
That sets the stage perfectly for this legal pretext for war. The administration needed a high-leverage legal tool to engage in kinetic action without, seeking a congressional declaration of war or direct UN approval.
And that tool came in the form of Foreign Terrorist Organization, or FTO, designations.
Right.
FTO designation is a massive accelerator of conflict risk. It just lowers the political and legal threshold for using military force against associated groups no matter where they are operating.
The first big move came early in the year, right? In February 2025, they designated the street gang Tren de Aragua, or TDA, as an FTO.
They did. Now, TDA is a ruthless transnational criminal organization, no doubt about it.
But why did the administration suddenly label them terrorists and try to link them to Maduro?
Well, the administration's claim was that TDA was operating under the patronage or the protection of the Venezuelan leadership. They were suggesting a state-sponsored nexus.
But was there any truth to that?
Well, here's the thing. U.S. intelligence reports, which were later leaked, reportedly found no evidence of any direct operational or financial link between the TDA gang and Maduro's inner circle.
Oh.
So critics immediately jumped on that, arguing the designation was really a political maneuver.
Designed to set a precedent.
Exactly. To establish a precedent for labeling groups operating out of Venezuela as terrorist threats that require military disruption.
That distinction is just vital. If U.S. intelligence itself couldn't prove a direct link, the designation becomes an instrument of foreign policy escalation.
Not an objective counterterrorism measure.
Precisely.
And then came the much bigger designation in November 2025, the Cartel de los Soles.
And this one is far more sensitive because it goes right to the heart of the Venezuelan state. We need to pause here, really explain what the Cartel de los Soles is, because the term cartel is, well, it's misleading if you're thinking of something like the Sinaloa organization.
That's a critical point, a really critical point. Experts contend that Cartel de los Soles is less a formalized, hierarchical drug trafficking organization with a central leader and more of a shorthand term.
For what exactly?
It refers to a diffuse, deeply entrenched, and highly corrupt network operating within Venezuela's armed forces, particularly within the military high command.
Nice.
They facilitate smuggling, they protect trafficking routes, and they use state assets like military aircraft and coastal patrols to enable the trade. It is effectively the state itself operating criminally.
So by designating this internal state network as an FTO, the U.S. administration essentially declared that major parts of the Venezuelan military establishment are legitimate targets for military intervention.
And this is where the legal pivot becomes, frankly, chilling. The U.S. administration's internal legal justification for lethal strikes rests on declaring a non-international armed conflict, or NIA, as it's often abbreviated.
NIAC. Okay, what does that mean in practical terms for the rules of engagement? Why is that classification so significant?
It changes everything. Under international law, declaring an NIA a conflict between a state and a non-state armed group gives the U.S. military the right to apply the laws of war rather than standard law enforcement rules.
So they can classify individuals on suspected boats as what?
As combatants or unprivileged belligerents. And that allows the use of lethal force.
That's a staggering expansion of authority. It effectively allows the military to conduct operations that would normally be restricted to war zones in waters that are otherwise considered international.
And UN experts have been quick to condemn this. I mean, they're arguing that using lethal force in international waters without a proper defined legal basis.
It's a violation.
It violates the UN Charter, the International Law of the Sea, and could amount to extrajudicial executions. They've even called these preparatory acts a graver breach of the UN Charter. The global legal community is watching this very, very closely.
Oh, I bet.
They see it as a dangerous precedent.
And this legal framework has now translated into kinetic reality through Operation Southern Spear.
Yes, formalized and announced on November 14th, 2025. The stated purpose is to remove narco-terrorists from our hemisphere and secure our homeland. This is the operational name for the military buildup and all the subsequent strikes.
And the campaign has been undeniably lethal. I mean, we are past rhetoric and we are into body counts.
Indeed. Since September 2nd, 2025, which is when the kinetic phase clearly began, there have been at least 20 documented lethal strikes on suspected drug-running boats.
Wow, 20. Where are these happening?
Primarily in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific operational areas.
And the casualty figures from this early stage of Operation Southern Spear are sobering?
At least 83 deaths have been confirmed.
Wow, really?
Yes. And this is intensifying serious questions about the targeting process, the transparency of the military's reporting, and the risk of collateral damage, especially given, the low-tech nature of many of these drug-running operations often involve coerced or just unwitting civilian crews.
So the key takeaway from this first part is that the U.S. military is systematically creating a precedent.
Yes, for the normalization of kinetic action against targets related to the Maduro regime's illicit activities, the successful execution of these maritime strikes against the so-called Cartel de los Soles.
It lowers the political friction.
Exactly. It lowers the political friction required to justify similar strikes against land-based targets inside Venezuelan territory if the conflict escalates.
Things like drug processing facilities or command elements of the Cartel de los Soles itself.
Precisely.
Okay, let's pivot now to the physical force that's been deployed, because the size and sophistication of this force really dictates the calculus. We're calling it massive, but analysis suggests it's optimized for coercion, not for invasion.
That's the right way to look at it. The force is precision strike optimized. The centerpiece is the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, the CSG.
And we need to be clear for you, this isn't just one ship.
No. This is an entire integrated warfighting system. It includes the Ford, the newest, most advanced nuclear-powered aircraft carrier supported by a high-end cruiser, the USS Lake Erie, and multiple destroyers. High-end Arleigh Burke-class destroyers.
And it brings with it advanced aircrafts. We're talking F-35 stealth jets for both strike and reconnaissance.
Immense high-end long-range capability. If they want to strike any fixed target in Venezuela, they can do it.
But is this force totaling, what, maybe 15,000 personnel? Is that enough to actually execute a conventional invasion of a country the size of Venezuela?
That is the essential analytic question, and the answer is a definitive no.
No.
While the force looks massive, military strategists analyze force posture based on the terrain and the scale of the objective. The deployment also includes the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, the ARG, which carries roughly 2,200 Marines ready for insertion. But just consider the scale. Venezuela is a vast country, a population of nearly 30 million, rugged terrain, huge urban sprawl in Caracas.
So what would a necessary invasion force actually look like?
Well, we can look at analysis from think tanks like CSIS, and they suggest that the current force is, and I'm quoting here, well below the level needed for full-scale combat operations.
Right.
Based on past conflicts on counterinsurgency doctrine, war planners would want somewhere between 50,000 and 150,000 troops.
50 to 150,000.
Yes, supported by robust logistics to even attempt a conventional ground campaign and the occupation or stabilization that would follow.
So the current force is maybe 10% of the minimum required number.
At best.
That's key. That is key context for you, the listener. It solidifies the understanding that a direct conventional invasion is assessed as having a low probability in the immediate future.
It is. This force is built for coercion and for targeted strikes, not occupation. It's optimized for precision, standoff strikes, surgical engagement.
And the strategic hub for this entire operation is Puerto Rico.
It has reemerged as the strategic node, yes. It required the rapid reopening and modernization of the former Roosevelt Roads Naval Station to host F-35s and naval vessels.
And from this forward operating base, the range to Caracas is terrifyingly close.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the force is loaded for long-range, high-precision strikes. The naval assets in the region are estimated to carry around 170 Tomahawk cruise missiles.
170? How does that compare historically?
To give you a comparison, that is a similar quantum of firepower used during the initial limited intervention in Libya back in 2011.
So it's a statement.
It's a very clear statement. We have the ability to severely degrade your military and your infrastructural capabilities, basically overnight.
So the U.S. message is, we can hit you, we can destabilize you, but we are not prepared to get bogged down in a ground war. How is Maduro's regime responding to this very precise threat looming just offshore?
Well, Maduro's response is a classic example of counter-deterrence. He's using nationalistic rhetoric and highly visible defensive preparations.
What do they look like?
He's initiated nationwide military drills, coastal live-fire exercises, and he's made sure that VTV, the state television, is saturated with images of readiness. He's constantly invoking Simon Bolivar, vowing to defend every inch of this blessed land from the imperialist threat.
He's trying to frame any U.S. action as aggressive foreign intervention, not just some surgical anti-drug operation.
That is his core objective, yes. And his military strategy is focused on asymmetrical warfare.
Making the cost of intervention just too high.
Exactly, making it politically and militarily prohibitive. They're banking on a prolonged resistance strategy using urban and jungle guerrilla tactics if U.S. forces ever tried to come ashore.
A quagmire.
A quagmire. The very thing the U.S., based on the troop numbers we just discussed, is clearly trying to avoid.
Are there specific, tangible, defensive preparations we can see on the ground?
Yes, there are. We've seen installations of concrete anti-vehicle hedgehog barriers placed strategically along the Caracas-La Guaira highway choke points.
And that highway is the main lifeline connecting the capital to the coast.
To its primary port and airport. So fortifying those routes signals a clear intent to slow down or even block any conventional rapid advance toward the capital.
And what about air defenses? They're facing F-35s and Tomahawks. What's Maduro showing off there?
Well, Venezuela is deliberately displaying its Russian-made air defense systems. This includes the P-18-2M long-range radar systems, the medium-range Buck M2E surface-to-air missile systems, and the longer-range S-300 systems.
We're trying to signal that U.S. aircraft would face a genuine risk of interception.
Right. It complicates U.S. targeting runs, and it would require extensive suppression of enemy air defense seed operations, which are very resource-intensive.
And finally, there's the manpower issue. Maduro claims he's mobilized the Bolivarian militia. What are the numbers?
He claims up to 8 million members.
8 million.
Now, analysts think that figure is highly suspect in terms of combat readiness or actual organized capacity.
Right.
However, even if only a fraction of that, say 10%, were mobilized and willing to engage in organized resistance or civil disruption, that's still 800,000 personnel.
Wow.
It's a massive number for potential internal resistance that would just exponentially complicate any stabilization or post-conflict security scenario.
But the greatest external restraint on U.S. action isn't Maduro's defenses, it's the Russia-China break.
That's a tough one. This is arguably the most profound inhibitor on U.S. action. Both Moscow and Beijing have issued strong public statements reaffirming their support for Maduro.
And they're condemning external interference.
Unequivocally. China has referred to Venezuela as an intimate friend and a key partner in its Belt and Road initiatives in Latin America.
And Russia's support is more than just talk, right? They're providing actual material support right there in the theater.
That's vital. Russia has reportedly increased its military support, focusing heavily on logistics, specialized maintenance for existing platforms, and potentially delivering new defensive systems like the Pantsir S-1 point defense systems and more Buck M2E components.
And there was a high-profile flight recently.
There was. The arrival of a Russian heavy cargo aircraft in Caracas, which was presumed to be carrying military supplies or maintenance personnel.
This immediately complicates the U.S. calculus because it introduces the specter of a proxy conflict.
Absolutely. Any large-scale U.S. action carries the latent risk of escalation. If U.S. forces were to strike a Venezuelan military target, and that target was known to be staffed by Russian technical advisors,
the geopolitical fallout would be immense.
It would be. Moscow and Beijing's public commitment ensures that any large-scale U.S. action risks escalating into a major geopolitical crisis, forcing the U.S. to divert resources and attention from primary strategic theaters like Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific.
The military component is constrained, but the geopolitical component, well, that might be the most crippling factor preventing a full-scale intervention. The U.S. needs regional support for a sustained campaign, but its current strategy is actively alienating its most critical neighbors.
Oh, wow. Yes. That's the critical operational hurdle. I mean, to understand the feasibility of any U.S. ground operation, you have to look at Colombia.
Right.
Bogotá's cooperation is non-negotiable for sustained success, yet President Gustavo Petro is actively opposing the U.S. buildup.
He called the U.S. military presence disrespectful, and he's explicitly against military action. What has he actually done that matters operationally?
Crucially, Petro has suspended specific intelligence cooperation with the U.S. over this, and Colombia is the U.S.'s most valuable intelligence partner in the region. They offer forward operating access, vital insight into trafficking routes, financial networks, internal Venezuelan movements. Shutting that spigot off is a massive setback.
And Washington's response to a key Democratic ally refusing to cooperate.
In an astonishing move, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned Petro himself and members of his support network, placing them on the OFAC sanctions list.
Clinton list.
The Clinton list, yes. Alleging unspecified links to illicit activities or obstruction of justice.
Wow.
Analysts universally saw it as diplomatic retribution and coercion.
Sanctioning the sitting president of a neighboring democracy is almost unprecedented. It really underscores the desperation here. But why does Colombia's refusal create such an insurmountable hurdle?
It's logistics and terrain. Venezuela is ringed by hostile jungle and mountain ranges. A sustained ground operation without Colombian cooperation is technically infeasible.
For two main reasons, right?
Right. First, airspace. U.S. aircraft can't rely on uncontested transit or refueling support. Second, territory. Colombia provides the only viable large-scale staging grounds for forces and humanitarian efforts.
And without the intelligence sharing.
They'd be flying blind. Bogotá's opposition is, operationally speaking, a veto.
So the U.S. needs its neighbors, but its actions are pushing them away.
Exactly. It creates a massive legitimacy deficit. The U.S. can't claim to be liberating the hemisphere when the hemisphere's main democratic leaders are condemning the intervention.
What about Brazil? President Lula has been trying to position himself as the regional power broker.
Lula's all about soft power and mediation. He's trying to find a negotiated settlement with Maduro. A unilateral U.S. invasion just sidelines him completely.
It forces him into a corner.
An agonizing choice. Either endorse U.S. action, which damages his regional leadership, or oppose the U.S., straining economic ties. His preference is clearly to reject U.S. unilateralism.
And Mexico, under President Claudia Sheinbaum, would face domestic political backlash if she seemed to support the U.S.
Of course. The memory of historical U.S. interventions in Latin America is long and painful. Sheinbaum's government would face immense domestic opposition. It just limits her ability to offer even passive political cover.
So for all these actors, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, the political cost of cooperating is just way too high right now.
It far exceeds any perceived benefit of regime change, which critically undercuts any long-term stabilization plan the U.S. might have.
Now let's talk about the most immediate national security implication for the U.S., the humanitarian tsunami risk.
Yes. Venezuela already represents the second largest displacement crisis globally, second only to Syria. We're talking nearly 7.9 million refugees and migrants.
Scattered throughout the Americas.
Exactly. And military operations, or a violent power struggle triggered by targeted strikes, would instantaneously trigger a massive, catastrophic new migration flow.
Not a trickle.
No, this would be a surge that would quickly overwhelm Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, before accelerating northward.
How large could it realistically get?
Well, estimates suggest even a limited strike campaign that destabilizes internal security could trigger an additional flow of 1 to 2 million people in the short term.
1 to 2 million more.
And that's on top of a crisis that's already cost regional governments billions. If the situation devolved into widespread civil conflict post-Maduro, analysts predict it could lead to the largest migration surge in hemispheric history.
The grim irony here is hard to miss. Military actions supposedly aimed at securing the homeland could immediately generate the biggest challenge to U.S. border security in history.
It's utterly counterproductive. And then there are the economic ripple effects, particularly with global oil market inflation.
Venezuela has the largest proven crude oil reserves in the world. Its production is crippled right now, but military action still carries a high risk to global oil prices.
That's the key distinction. Because U.S. domestic oil production is high and Venezuela's current output is relatively low, the probability of an immediate catastrophic global price spike is lower. But
targeted strikes against infrastructure are still a huge concern.
A huge concern. We call them single points of failure. The most vulnerable are the specialized ports for oil exports and the major refineries.
Those strikes on those could cause wider inflation.
Oh, yes. Sector analyses estimate oil prices could increase by as much as 10 to 20% in the event of conflict, and that would economically punish American consumers who are already dealing with inflation.
Now, if the U.S. did manage to oust Maduro, the argument is often made that Venezuelan oil could come rushing back to the market and stabilize prices. Is that realistic?
Absolutely not. That's a fantasy. The infrastructure, the pipes, the pumps, the refineries, it's old, it's suffered from years of deferred maintenance, and it's been crippled by sanctions preventing the import of essential parts.
So rebounding production would be slow.
Incredibly slow. It would require massive capital, specialized foreign labor, and years, maybe a decade, of significant investment before production approaches pre-Chavez levels. It's not an instant fix.
Finally, let's touch on the long-term impact on great power competition. Does U.S. military intervention in Venezuela push the entire continent closer to Beijing and Moscow?
It absolutely accelerates a phenomenon we call defensive hedging.
Defensive hedging.
When the U.S. demonstrates a willingness to ignore multilateral institutions and use force against a sovereign state in the hemisphere, it triggers profound alarm bells across Latin America.
And their natural defense is to seek partnerships with other powers who can offer leverage against future U.S. intervention.
Precisely. South American countries may rapidly increase military and security engagement with U.S. competitors, China and Russia, to defend themselves. This actively counters long-term U.S. strategic objectives. It's a strategic own goal.
And there's a specific, highly concerning intelligence vulnerability tied to this deployment itself, isn't there?
Yes. U.S. Navy vessels in Operation Southern Spear, including high-end destroyers like the USS Sampson and the cruiser USS Lake Erie, have been docking at various ports in the region.
And many of these ports are managed or are heavily influenced by China.
Specifically, the Hong Kong-based conglomerate CK Hutchison.
So when a U.S. warship docks at a port managed by a company with ties to Beijing, what intelligence opportunities does that create for China?
It gives China an invaluable front-row seat to U.S. standard operating procedures. They can gather data on naval patterns of life, logistical requirements, communication procedures, ship profiles, how the U.S. manages a high-intensity deployment far from home. This is meticulously collected and can be applied directly to their naval planning in the Indo-Pacific.
It's an intelligence coup derived directly from the deployment.
It really is.
This next part of the deep dive, based on the internal analysis in the research stack, is the most troubling. It addresses the consequences of success. Assuming the U.S. does succeed in ousting Maduro, the sources reveal a stunning lack of preparation for what comes next.
This is the planning gap, and it's a critical failure of strategy. U.S. officials have reported that, and I'm quoting again, far more planning has gone into striking at the Maduro government than on what it would take to govern Venezuela should the operation succeed.
Far more planning into striking than governing. That is terrifyingly vague. When they were pressed, what was the official response on post-conflict stabilization plans?
One official, speaking anonymously, offered the extremely weak reassurance. We have the concepts of a plan.
The concepts of a plan.
That's it. That's it. It suggests that beyond broad strokes and maybe a list of potential replacement leaders, there is no detailed, evidence-based interagency strategy for the immense task of securing and stabilizing a fractured country of 30 million people.
This just echoes the ghosts of stabilization history that the U.S. seems intent on repeating, despite decades of failing to learn these lessons.
So absolutely. We only need to look at the painful histories of failed U.S. stabilization efforts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, Haiti, Libya, South Sudan.
The list goes on.
It does. And the post-mortems on these conflicts consistently reveal the same deep systemic flaws. A lack of strategic clarity on the end state, cripplingly poor interagency coordination, and a consistent failure to systematically apply evidence-based lessons.
And the core job of stabilization is establishing basic, consistent security and rule of law. That's nearly impossible when the very institutions you're replacing are themselves thoroughly criminalized, like the Cartel de los Soles network.
It's the ultimate catch-22. If you dissolve the existing security forces, you create an immediate power vacuum filled by chaos. If you try to reform them, you're relying on individuals with a long history of predatory, criminal behavior to suddenly become keepers of the peace.
Which brings us to the critical stabilization questions that are just not being addressed. Let's start with security and rule of law.
The question is, how do you establish security in localities when the existing forces are the problem? Past stabilization successes, rare as they are, worked best where basic, consistent security was provided. In Venezuela, the first responders with former regime elements, local militia, and competing criminal factions.
A recipe for chaos.
Managing that would require a significant, prolonged international security presence, which the current force is explicitly not designed for.
And the second critical question is the issue of external spoilers, the regional actors we just talked about.
That's the strategic disaster in the making. How do you align Colombia, Brazil, Mexico toward a common vision when they have competing agendas and may actively prefer different outcomes or different factions in a post-Maduro Venezuela?
Libya is the terrifying, instructive example here.
It really is. I mean, 14 years after the fall of Gaddafi, Libya is still fractured, with regional powers like Turkey, Russia, and the UAE actively backing alternative factions and proxies, prolonging the civil conflict.
And a post-Maduro vacuum is ripe for that kind kind of fracturing.
Absolutely. With neighboring states maybe funding preferred former regime elements or opposition leaders, deepening the instability.
The ultimate risk here is what analysts call the empty victory. What happens if the U.S. achieves its goal of removing Maduro, but then, lacking a real stabilization plan, just walks away?
Wow.
What are the consequences?
Walking away from an unstable post-Maduro Venezuela would have immediate catastrophic negative national security implications for the U.S. and the entire hemisphere. It guarantees a protracted violent civil conflict which feeds directly back into that humanitarian tsunami risk we talked about.
It generates greater regional instability.
And crucially, it creates an ungovernable space dominated by even more decentralized and ruthless criminal enterprises than the ones the U.S. supposedly went in to stop.
So the U.S. appears prepared only for the tactical success of the strikes, not the strategic requirement of what comes after.
That is the consensus view. It's a high-risk, low-reward intervention strategy that risks replacing an entrenched tyrant with a chaotic, violent, and ungovernable space. The political vacuum is often far more dangerous than the tyrant it replaces.
This has been an incredibly detailed deep dive into the calculus of conflict in the Caribbean, made possible by the exhaustive analysis from expert trader. Let's try to synthesize the duality we've discussed for you, the listener.
Okay. We've established a high probability of intensified limited kinetic action. So targeted strikes against maritime and likely land-based FTO targets, all justified by those controversial legal designations. But crucially, there is a low probability of a full conventional invasion due to overwhelming logistical constraints, especially the explicit determined opposition of neighboring Colombia.
The U.S. is positioned as the archer with an arrow drawn. They have to either launch a wider campaign or stand down and absorb the diplomatic cost of a massive failed escalation. But the primary strategic risk hanging over the hemisphere isn't a calculated, protracted war. It's the potential for sheer miscalculation.
An airstrike that hits a sensitive military installation or a strike that results in unexpected casualties of regime figures or their international partners. It could trigger unexpected, perhaps overwhelming retaliation by Venezuelan armed forces.
And that could rapidly escalate the crisis beyond the war on drugs mandate.
And into a true conventional conflict that the U.S. is not currently equipped for.
Thank you again to expert Traderuk for providing the comprehensive materials that allowed us to explore this extremely volatile situation in such depth.
And here is the core provocative question we'll leave you with, one that really illustrates the destructive cycle of this conflict.
Go on.
The U.S. spent years using sanctions to remove a dictator, right? But those sanctions compelled that regime to deepen its reliance on illicit activities, the very thing the U.S. now cites as the cause for military action.
Oh dear.
So if sanctions compelled corruption, what unforeseen catastrophic criminal enterprises might a failed stabilization effort, a true political vacuum unleash in a post-Maduro Venezuela?
That is the geopolitical iceberg hiding beneath the surface of this standoff. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.